Did you know that there are Japanese versions of Prince rackets? Here's one such racket, the Phantom 03-100. I saw this when I was visiting tennis shops in Japan and I knew instantly that I had to have it. So an impulsive purchase if there ever was one. What really got to me is the fact that this has a 16.5mm beam at the throat of the racket. I mean, just look at how crazy thin this racket looks next to a quote-unquote normal racket. I feel that it has more in common with my squash racket than any other tennis racket, at the throat at least. This racket also has Prince's O ports, which in my opinion pair well with this racket. And I want to give you my perspective on them because that perspective is informed by Prince's legacy in another adjacent sport, squash. I've been testing this racket for a few months now and I'm switching to it. They definitely don't make them like this anymore, and I'm convinced that there's nothing on the market quite like this. I'm going to break this video down into two parts. The first is going to deal with Prince's 03 ports and my perspective on them. The second is going to deal with this racket's string pattern, its thin beam, and other attributes that make it play the way it does. I was lucky enough to be able to play with both the 03 and the non-03 versions of this racket before committing to the 03 model. In the current 2024 lineup of Phantoms, there's no 03 model, at least as of the recording of this video. Maybe there will be one later, maybe not. If not, I think it's a shame because I think the 03 ports are worth it, especially on this frame. Regular viewers of this channel will know that squash was my sport of choice before I switched over to tennis during COVID, although I still do play a fair bit of squash. And for a fair bit of time, my racket of choice was the Prince Rebel 950, which itself was inspired by one of my favorite players, Nicol David, who is arguably one of the best players to ever step on a squash court. I mean, the period between 2006 and 2009 should go down in history as one of the most dominant someone has ever been. Nicol David herself played with the Prince Rebel, although I'm unsure whether it had 03 ports on them. But regardless, she promoted the ones that did have 03 ports, and I couldn't help but pick one up for myself. That is a racket I learned squash on. I sold it later, and to this date it remains one of my biggest regrets. So, needless to say, I know these O ports pretty well. I've learned a sport on a racket with them, and then I've transitioned away to a racket without them. 03 ports on a racket make its sweet spot feel huge. This I can verify. Some say that it also makes the rackets a bit springy and trampoliny, but I personally have never felt this. I've talked in a previous video about how variation of performance across the string bed is my favorite way of thinking about a sweet spot. Now, this concept is applicable to the sweet spot enabled by the 03 ports because the performance of the string bed doesn't decrease too drastically if you don't strike the ball dead in the sweet spot, unlike it would in a pro staff or a prestige, for example. It doesn't mean that the sweet spot becomes vague or hard to find, which is often suggested with these 03 rackets. The sweet spot is where it always is. It's just that the bigger sweet spot allows you to do more with the string bed than you normally would, and the price you pay for it is a less precise sweet spot. In short, no advantage comes for free. Let me give you a concrete example of this. I've talked in a previous video about how squash influenced my use of the string bed because my rackets of choice in that sport, including the Prince Rebel 950 that Nicol David used, they're teardrop shaped. So when trying to hit a drop shot, I can make contact with the string bed just a bit lower than where the sweet spot would normally be, and that deader response gives me a lot more control than I would have normally gotten with this loose of a tension. I actually learned this from playing squash, where the mains tend to be quite long, so there's a lot of variability in the response you get from the string bed from the very tip of the racket to the very bottom. And here, I tend to hit my drop shots very close to around this area of the racket. I find myself doing this in tennis too. This is why I find it difficult to play with control-oriented rackets such as the Prestiges and the Pro Staffs. It's why I think I gravitate towards power rackets. The softer response of this 03 string bed that's absent of any excessive vibrations is what allows me to play drop shots as I prefer to play them. I'm not implying that my way of playing drop shots is the right way, or that striking the sweet spot consistently isn't something that everyone should strive for. I'm just saying that this racket allows me to play as I want to. But as I've said before, no advantage comes for free. These rackets are often described as muted, which is true in the sense that they're absent of any excessive vibrations, but not fair because you get much more in return than just comfort. Also, this mutedness is much more pronounced when you pair this racket with stiff, plasticky strings. As an example, I tried Hyper-G in this because, well, look at the fluorescent green color on this racket, and I did not like it. But then I tried Texas Quadra Twist, which is softer and crispy once it's broken in, and that played amazing. And it really showed me just how much feel a thin beamed racket like this can provide. But this O-port feel does require getting used to. So if you feel inspired by this video and want to try this or an older model of this racket, then bear in mind you will need time to adjust. As a reference, this racket is essentially the same as the outgoing 03 100X model that was released in 2020 in North America. These 03 ports also make the racket noticeably more aerodynamic, and it swings much faster. This very conveniently ties right into part 2 of this review. Okay, let's talk about its string pattern, which I promise leads to the 16.5mm beam that I teased at the beginning of the video. This racket has a pretty open 16x18 pattern, and it's here to give you a higher launch angle and to help you with depth, because this thin beam puts this racket squarely into the low-powered camp. This itself ties into the fact that the 16x18 string pattern allows you to generate spin noticeably easier than on a 16x19, for example. Some of this is down to the O-ports because they allow for a lot more string movement. Combine this with the fact that this racket has a 100 square inch head size, which offers a really generous hitting surface, and that it has a really headlight balance of 31 centimeters, and you start to realize that this racket literally begs you to swing it fast. Most of my shots have this nice arc on them and they dip just before the baseline. Like, seriously, I've never gotten better depth than with this racket, which still amazes me because the low-powered response of this racket doesn't initially set your expectations up for such a result. And because the thin beam of this racket makes it low-powered, you can swing out too. For me, this just really makes for fun sessions that translate to better ball striking and more opportunity for game improvement. I mean, it's a win-win situation. The feeling I get when playing with this racket is, funnily enough, similar to the feeling I get when I play with the Babolat Pure arrows. That aerodynamic beam on the arrow really does make a difference when you're trying to swing the racket fast and get spin. This confused me initially. How could a stiff, thick beam racket like the arrow compare in any way to a soft flexi frame like the Phantom? And then it occurred to me, you know what also cuts through the air really fast? A really thin beam. Something like this negates having to shape your beam aerodynamically because it naturally encounters less air resistance because of its thinness. And mind you, this is not a box beam like some of the others in the Phantom line. This is rounded, like any other racket that is designed for the modern game. The Phantom 03 100 is a masterpiece, a control frame for advanced players that has great feel if you select your strings properly, and is completely adept at enabling the modern spin-oriented all-court style of play. And if you're not an advanced player, you can still go out and have fun on the court because unlike the Prestiges and the Pro Staffs, you still get comfort, forgiveness, and performance because of the 03 ports and the flexible nature of this frame. This is truly a player's racket, but for everyone, whatever your level of ball striking may be. This is good design and engineering coming together to make something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And this is why I'm switching to the Phantom 03 100. This racket switch is a rare occurrence for me because I don't like switching rackets and I don't do racket reviews on this channel. There's two reasons for this. One is that I find I can basically pick up and play with any racket. I'm far more sensitive to strings, the grip shape, and grip feel. So I think I'm not that interested in rackets to begin with, and I don't think I would do racket reviews justice if I were to do them. And two, I know from experience that switching rackets frequently is bad for both my game and my golfer's elbow, which thankfully is not an issue anymore. But I feel that if I were to do racket reviews, it would sap the enjoyment I get out of tennis, and that's a serious no-go. I play tennis for fitness and fun. That's the extent of my ambition, even though it's in my nature to try and improve. But I'm confident that whether my level stays the same or I get better over time, this racket will accommodate whatever I try and do on court. The next natural question is, if this racket is string sensitive, then what string am I going to put in it? Well, that's for the next video to tackle because my string journey has also come to an end. See you in the next one.